There are mysteries that fade with time, growing quieter as the years pile up and the witnesses age and the trail goes cold. And then there are mysteries that do the opposite, that grow louder, stranger, and more compelling with every decade that passes without resolution. The case of D.B. Cooper belongs firmly in the second category. For more than half a century, the name has occupied a unique space in American culture, part criminal legend, part folk hero, part ghost story. A man who boarded a commercial flight in 1971, hijacked it with remarkable calm, collected $200,000 in ransom, and then jumped out of the back of the plane into a dark and stormy Pacific Northwest sky, and was never officially seen again. The FBI investigated the case for 45 years before quietly closing it in 2016, citing exhausted leads and dwindling resources. Thousands of suspects had been examined. Mountains of tip-line calls had been fielded, assessed, and discarded. Physical evidence was almost non-existent. The case had become, in the Bureau's own institutional memory, a symbol not of unsolved crime, but of the limits of what investigation alone can achieve when a criminal simply refuses to be found. But someone kept looking, and what that person found, tucked away in a storage unit in Utah, buried under decades of accumulated silence, has sent shockwaves through the true crime community, reopened conversations at the highest levels of law enforcement, and finally, after 54 years, given the legend of D.B. Cooper a human face, a real name, and a story that is more extraordinary than anyone could have scripted. It was November 24, 1971, the day before Thanksgiving, when American airports were at their most crowded and harried, when gate agents were distracted and passengers were preoccupied with getting home. Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305, a short-haul Boeing 727 route connecting Portland, Oregon to Seattle, Washington, was the kind of flight nobody thought twice about. 30 minutes in the air, barely enough time to finish a cup of coffee, the sort of commuter hop that barely registered as an event in the lives of the people taking it. The man who boarded using the name Dan Cooper did not look like someone planning to make history. He was described by crew members as middle-aged, somewhere in his mid-40s, with dark hair, a composed demeanor, and the unremarkable appearance of a businessman on a routine trip. He wore a dark suit and a clip-on tie. He ordered a bourbon and soda and paid for it with exact change. He did not fidget. He did not appear nervous. He sat in a window seat near the rear of the aircraft and waited. Shortly after takeoff, he passed a handwritten note to Florence Schaffner, one of the flight attendants. She assumed it was a phone number, the occupational hazard of working in the air in an era before everyone had a smartphone to stare at, and slipped it into her pocket without reading it. He leaned toward her and said, quietly, that she ought to look at what he had written. When she did, everything changed. The note informed her that he had a bomb in his briefcase, and that he intended to use it if his demands were not met. His demands were precise and considered. $200,000 in $20 bills for parachutes, 2 primary, 2 reserve, and a fuel truck standing by in Seattle to refuel the aircraft for a subsequent flight. The specificity of the request was striking. For parachutes, not 2, a detail that suggested he either anticipated company or wanted to prevent authorities from simply handing him a sabotaged rig, knowing they would be reluctant to tamper with all 4. This was not improvised. This had been planned. The pilot, Captain William Scott, radioed the situation to air traffic control using the appropriate hijacking code. On the ground, the machinery of federal response activated immediately. By the time Flight 305 touched down in Seattle, the FBI had been notified and the Northwest Orient executives had authorized meeting the demands. The passengers were deplaned without incident, seemingly unaware of what had been happening around them. The money was delivered in a bag. The parachutes were handed over. And then, with only the flight crew and a skeleton team on board, Cooper directed the plane south toward Mexico City, at a low altitude and a reduced airspeed he specified himself. Somewhere over the dense, rain-soaked forests of southwestern Washington, at approximately 8 o'clock in the evening, D.B. Cooper opened the rear air stair of the Boeing 727, a feature unique to that aircraft model, deployable in flight, and stepped off into a 200-mile-per-hour wind at an altitude of around 10,000 feet. The crew felt a change in cabin pressure. When they landed in Reno, Nevada for refueling, there was no sign of him anywhere on the aircraft. He had simply gone. What followed was one of the most extensive manhunts in American law enforcement history, and one of its most comprehensively unsuccessful. Hundreds of FBI agents descended on the estimated jump zone, a rugged, heavily forested stretch of territory near the Washoga River in southwestern Washington state. They were joined by military paratroopers, state police, search and rescue teams, and tracker dogs. They searched for days, then weeks, covering the terrain on foot, by helicopter, and by boat. They found nothing. Not a boot print. Not a scrap of fabric. Not a discarded parachute. Not a single bill from the ransom. The forest had absorbed D.B. Cooper as completely as if he had never existed, and the trail, such as it was, went cold before it had properly begun. The media, meanwhile, made an early error that would permanently alter the story's identity. The man had given his name as Dan Cooper. Somewhere in the frantic early reporting, a miscommunication transformed Dan into D.B., and the correction never quite caught up. The legend of D.B. Cooper was born from a mistake, which seemed appropriate for a case that would generate so much confusion in the decades ahead. The FBI's investigation continued for years, accumulating over 1,000 named suspects, none of whom could be definitively connected to the crime. The physical evidence was vanishingly sparse. The one significant exception arrived in 1980, when an 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram, on a family camping trip along the Columbia River, dug up a small bundle of rotted bills partially buried in the sand. The serial numbers matched the ransom. It was the first and only physical trace of the money ever recovered, and it raised more questions than it resolved. Had Cooper died in the jump, the money washing downstream over 9 years? Had he deliberately placed it there to mislead investigators? Nobody could say. The case remained technically open for another 3.5 decades after that discovery, classified as active but effectively frozen. In 2016, the FBI announced it was formally suspending the investigation, redirecting the resources toward more actionable cases. D.B. Cooper officially had won. Dan Grider spent his career in the air, a commercial airline pilot with more than 24,000 logged flight hours. He understood aviation in the granular, mechanical way that only comes from a lifetime of actually flying aircraft. When he retired and turned to YouTube, building a channel focused on flying, aviation history, and the culture of the cockpit, it was perhaps inevitable that D.B. Cooper would eventually become his subject. The case was irresistible to anyone who knew planes and loved mysteries, and Grider was a person who qualified on both counts. What was not inevitable was the depth and duration of the obsession that followed. Grider did not approach the Cooper case as content, as something to be researched adequately, packaged entertainingly, and moved on from. He approached it as a problem to be solved. He obtained FBI files that had been released under the Freedom of Information Act and worked through them with the methodical attention of someone trained to read technical documents carefully. He studied wind data, topographical maps, and parachute deployment physics to reconstruct the probable jump zone with a precision that the original searchers, operating in 1971 without modern computational tools, could not have managed. He built models. He tested hypotheses. He eliminated possibilities. And the trail, followed with sufficient persistence and the analytical advantage of half a century's additional perspective, kept leading him to the same name, Richard Floyd McCoy, Jr. Richard McCoy's biography reads on its surface like a portrait of mid-century American rectitude. Born in Utah, raised in the Mormon faith, he served in Vietnam as a helicopter pilot, earning decorations for courage under fire. He returned home, married, had children, and enrolled at Brigham Young University to pursue a law degree. His neighbors described him as quiet and polite. His church knew him as a committed member of the congregation. He coached youth sports and taught skydiving, a passion developed during his military service, at a local club. He was, by every external measure, a model citizen. On April 7, 1972, 5 months and 2 weeks after D.B. Cooper vanished, Richard McCoy boarded United Airlines Flight 855 in Denver, Colorado. He was carrying a briefcase. He was wearing a business suit. Somewhere over Utah, He passed a handwritten note to a flight attendant informing her that he had a bomb and outlining his demands: $500,000 in cash for parachutes and a fueled aircraft prepared for onward flight. The demands were met. The passengers were released at San Francisco, and McCoy, just like Cooper before him, directed the plane back into the air and jumped somewhere over the Utah desert. Unlike Cooper, he was caught. He left fingerprints on a water glass. He left a handwritten note in the cockpit. The FBI matched the prints within days and arrested him at his home in Provo, where he was spending time with his family as though nothing unusual had occurred. He was convicted and sentenced to 45 years in federal prison. In 1974, he escaped in a garbage truck with several other inmates and was killed 3 months later in a shootout with FBI agents in Virginia. The parallels between McCoy and Cooper were striking enough that the FBI investigated whether they were the same person almost immediately after McCoy's arrest. They concluded they were not, citing differences in physical description. Witnesses described Cooper as appearing to be in his mid-40s with olive-toned skin, while McCoy was 29 with a fair complexion, and differences in the handwriting and phrasing of the hijacked notes. McCoy, the Bureau officially determined, was a copycat. Dan Grider was not convinced. A military-trained operative, he argued, would understand the value of altering his apparent age and appearance for a high-stakes operation. The differences in the notes could reflect deliberate variation. The physical description discrepancies were based on witness recollections from a stressful situation on a dimly lit aircraft. None of it was conclusive in either direction. And the procedural similarities between the two hijackings: the same aircraft type, the same rear staircase exit, the same calm professionalism, the same demand for multiple parachutes, were too specific to be attributed to coincidence or casual imitation by someone who merely read about Cooper in the newspapers. The investigation that changed everything began with a hunch and ended in a dusty storage unit in Utah. Grider had developed information suggesting that members of McCoy's extended family had maintained possession of items connected to his activities, items that had never been disclosed to investigators, either because the family did not understand their significance or because they understood it all too well. What he found in that storage unit was a parachute, not a generic parachute, not a common civilian rig of the era, but a military-style harness with modifications that matched, with uncomfortable specificity, details recorded in the FBI's 1971 evidence files from the Cooper investigation. The same unusual harness clips, the same reinforced cord loops, the same overall configuration. Grider photographed everything, contacted parachute experts, and had the rig examined by people with the technical knowledge to assess its provenance. Their assessment: the modifications were consistent with those documented in the Cooper case files, and the rig was of the correct era and manufacture. Later, a second parachute emerged, this one located in a box at a family member's home in Provo, stored behind Christmas decorations and old photograph albums, as though someone had placed it there intending for it to be overlooked indefinitely. This rig shared the same unusual characteristics. Grider had it examined by the same experts. The conclusion was the same. He brought his findings public in a series of YouTube videos that generated significant media attention. The response from McCoy's family was initially silence, not the dismissive silence of people with nothing to hide, but the weighted silence of people who had been carrying something for a very long time and were not yet ready to put it down. The FBI, which had officially closed the Cooper case in 2016, did not remain indifferent to what Grider had found. The parachute evidence was specific enough and the public attention significant enough that agents made contact with Grider and arranged to take possession of the rigs for forensic examination at the Bureau's laboratory facility in Quantico, Virginia. The examination focused partly on the physical characteristics of the parachutes and partly on the possibility of recovering DNA evidence. Cooper had left behind his clip-on tie on the aircraft, a detail that had received periodic attention over the decades, but had never produced a definitive identification because there was no confirmed suspect to match the partial DNA profile recovered from it. McCoy was deceased, having been killed in 1974, but DNA comparison through family members was potentially viable. The Bureau considered the possibility of DNA-based analysis comparing the Thai evidence to samples from McCoy's surviving children. Whether those tests have been conducted and what results they may have produced has not been officially confirmed. What is known is that the case, officially dormant for nearly a decade, had been effectively reactivated by what Grider found and what he made public. The most extraordinary development in the entire story was not the parachute. It was the conversation. After weeks of attempted contact, emails, phone calls, messages passed through intermediaries, Grider finally sat down with two of Richard McCoy's children, his daughter Shantae and his son Rick McCoy III. They had spent their entire lives in the shadow of their father's conviction, his escape, and his death. They had denied the Cooper rumors when those rumors surfaced. They had maintained silence when investigators came asking. But faced with the accumulated weight of the evidence Grider had assembled, something shifted. Rick McCoy III, according to Grider's account of the conversation, spoke carefully and with evident emotion. He said that the family had never wanted to believe it, that they had looked away from the signs for a long time. And then he said the words that sent Grider's video to viral prominence within hours of its posting. That as far as he could tell, looking at everything together, his father had been Cooper. That they had, in some part of themselves, always known. The admission was not a legal confession. It was not forensic proof. It was a family member, speaking from the accumulated knowledge of a lifetime lived alongside secrets, acknowledging what the evidence had been suggesting for decades. Whether it will be sufficient to close the case officially, to allow the FBI to reclassify D.B. Cooper from unknown to identified, remains to be seen. But for the millions of people who have followed this mystery across half a century, it was the closest thing to resolution the case has ever produced. The ghost, finally, has a name. The legend, at long last, has a face. And the man who stepped off the back of a Boeing 727 into the dark sky over the Pacific Northwest in November 1971 was, in all probability, a decorated veteran from Utah named Richard Floyd McCoy Jr., a man who taught Sunday school and coached youth sports, and, on one cold November evening, decided to disappear into the clouds with $200,000 and 54 years of mystery strapped to his chest.